Good day. I'm Matthias of Regenerations Creations, and today I want to talk about the last of my current core beliefs. This one is a recent addition, something that I have only begun to think about, but I thought it was powerful. It came from an episode of the Aubrey Marcus podcast, where he talks about his conception of the divine. Now, I've talked about the traditional conception of God from Christian theology in the past, where God is the greatest possible thing. So he is omnipotent or all powerful, omniscient or all knowing, omnipresent or ever present, and omnibenevolent or all good. But as I said in an earlier video, this conception of God is a bit too much for me to wrap my head around. When I try to think of what any of those things really mean, it gets me like thinking logically. But as an agnostic, I don't think that I have the capacity to logically understand like the true nature of God and what he wants. I need something that gives me more of a feeling, right? I think a feeling in a lot of ways is almost beyond words. It's impossible to fully explain, but we still get the full weight of that feeling, right? So it makes perfect sense to us. It's just hard to articulate it to others. Now, I tend to be more logically oriented, excuse me, but I have come to embrace my emotion and the power of feeling much more than I did before. It's almost like having a drug trip, right? Where you can't really explain it to somebody else, even if you had 1,000 words. But to someone who's already had that same experience, they'll understand what you mean with just one word, right? So I think that emotion needs to be tempered with logic to make sure you stay grounded and level-headed. But to forgo emotion is simply to misunderstand the human experience, at least in my eyes. So when I heard this particular Aubrey Marcus podcast, his conception of the divine did just that for me. Let me have an emotional response to thinking about God. The line that he said was something to the effect of, the divine is all power and all intimacy, which is why all power wielded without intimacy is evil. Now, in common parlance, intimacy is synonymous with sex and lust, but what he meant was more just connection, right? And I took it to mean something more like what I've been saying in other videos. All humans were made for each other. We're all one and the same. Distancing yourself from other humans is distancing yourself from part of yourself. So going forward, when I say intimacy, think of that. Being close with someone, letting yourself be vulnerable, taking your armor off, seeking to understand rather than be understood. So to be honest, I don't really remember which episode of the podcast that this was talked about on, or who the guest was, or even what they were really talking about, for the rest of the thing. It's just really that one line that struck a chord with me, really got me thinking and moving on this. So we need to combine power and intimacy. Now, as a student of history, when I think of power, I think of governmental and societal structures. So power without intimacy, to me, looks like the classic image of the tyrant, right? It's like one man holding and controlling all of the resources under his domain, seeking only to hold on to his power at the expense of everyone else. It's a common theme in stories about kings that they feel very isolated. When you hold all the power, everyone wants something from you. They either seek your downfall to claim your power for themselves, or they seek to be sycophants who will tell you whatever you want to hear so that you'll give them scraps of your power. It leaves you completely without intimacy because you can't trust anyone. Power without intimacy is also a good conception of the devil for me, right? So the devil is nothing but a tempter. He holds no real power, but is always tempting others with the promise of power. He shows you the path to material wealth and holding sway over others. But once you go down that path, you realize you're all alone, cut off from God and cut off from all those around you. Hence the lack of intimacy. So to go back to the history bent, I remember hearing something about, there's like a different take on the Dark Ages in history. Right, so most of us think of medieval times when we hear the Dark Ages, and that comes from an Enlightenment way of thinking where, now we're liberated men of science and reason, where back in the medieval times, the church kept us all stifled and controlled. Right, but in a broad sense, the term Dark Age usually refers to a period in history where there is just a lack of written records. Like in like in the time in Egypt after the Old Kingdom fell, right? So we have a lot of writing from the Old Kingdom and then later from the New Kingdom, but for a few hundred years there in between, all the writings seem to go away. So at first it looks like, oh my gosh, their society collapsed so far that everyone forgot how to write. How bad must times have been? They just descended into absolute chaos and anarchy, right? No culture anymore, no civilization. It's like a scary thought. But then we get more evidence and fill out the picture a bit more of these dark ages. And instead, we see that society still goes on. It's just that instead of being one giant unified empire, it becomes smaller, more localized kingdoms. I see this as a dance between order and chaos, light and dark, stillness and activity. The best example is Rome. Rome had this thing called the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. They bragged that their empire was so great and stable that a virgin could travel the length of their empire with bags of gold and no one would dare harm her. Sounds like a pretty beautiful vision, right? But then when you look a little closer, this peace was largely obtained by the mass slaughter, subjugation, and enslavement of all their newly acquired territories. Of course, both of these images I have just conjured are too simplistic to encapsulate the full truth of the time, but I think it works well enough, for us to get an understanding, to see where I'm coming from. So order and light bring passivity, while chaos and darkness bring activity. Would you rather live in a peaceful state that maintains its peace through military might and authoritarian power? Or would you rather live in a state of war and uncertainty, but where each individual retains more autonomy? Now, most of us would not want to live in either of those, right? You want to have some kind of middle ground. And that's where America comes in, at least theoretically, on paper, right? So as Benjamin Franklin said, those who would give up their essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Or put a little more simply, if you pick safety over freedom, then you don't deserve either. So America lets its citizens have guns, right? And this leads to a ton of problems. But also, if you take those guns away, well, now you're taking away freedom that all Americans have had, right? So you're limiting freedom and you're jeopardizing individual free will. And then you're also making it easier for tyrants to take power, right? So you have that like dark, chaotic activity when everybody has guns, but it keeps everything from, one power taking over everything and making everything passive, stale, without freedom. So going back to the Dark Ages point, it looks like a dark age because there's no unified government that's stabilizing everything. But once that goes away, the power becomes more localized and more intimate. So democratic republics, in theory at least, walk this narrow path of order and chaos. They build an organized structure, but then they let people express their free will by voting on laws and representatives. Right? So it tries to have that centralized power while still retaining some of the intimacy and localization. I don't know how to say it. By having it made up of local representatives and the people's will, basically. So we get the peace and stability of an empire, but the localized power of a dark age, as it were. Okay, so that's a bit of a tangent into history, but that's just where my brain goes. So let's try to tie it back into the theology of the divine. So as Aubrey Marcus put it, the divine is all power and all intimacy. So God made everything, knows everything, is everything, and yet he cares deeply about you as an individual. So humans and governments go evil when they lose that intimacy. They lose that caring about the individual. So now how do I try to use this knowledge to be a better person? The way I see it, to be the best possible person, I need to be a harmony of all of God's aspects: power, intimacy, and knowledge. In my personal life, I see intimacy as synonymous with goodness, right? To be a little simpler about it. So both intimacy and goodness to me mean that I need to treat others with respect and dignity. I need to see them and accept them for who they are while trying to help them be the best that they can be. So power, so this all leads me to this, right? So I think you need power, intimacy, and knowledge. Okay, so power without goodness is evil. Power without knowledge is reckless and heavy-handed. Goodness without power is ineffective. Goodness without knowledge is ignorance and leads to unintended consequences. Knowledge without power is meaningless, and knowledge without goodness is Luciferian. So if you want to be strong and use the power that you have at your disposal, make sure you're ever in the present to see its effects on others and yourself. Ever seek knowledge to plan and to readjust your course as you go. And then the only thing that you should use that power for is to increase the goodness in the world. So I have been Matthias of Regenerations Creations, and thank you all very much for listening. Have a good day.